afternoon. It's a pleasure to have John Kevin Regan. I hope that I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Regan as the first speaker of this semester. John started as a theoretical physicist. Kevin? John, no? Okay, Kevin. I guess you know your name better than I do. Kevin started as a theoretical physicist, and then he made the natural move to do experimental psychology, and he made many contributions in the field of visual perception. He's also interested in the question of consciousness, and now he's currently director of the Laboratoire Psychologie de la Perception. I don't know how to pronounce it. At the CNRS and Université Paris Descartes. Please.
Thank you for this excellent introduction. I must say I'm very honored to be here and somewhat intimidated, in fact. So thank you. I'm a bit. Thank you again. Before beginning, I want to thank Tali for inviting me. And also to say what a wonderful place this is here. Probably I feel a bit intimidated because no doubt we have here some of the most clever minds in neuroscience in the world. So I hope you will appreciate my humble contribution.
I think it's not working. Speak up.
So what is this curious drawing from Leonardo da Vinci? You have a man looking into a fishbowl, and suspended inside the fishbowl we have a glass sphere. And when the man looks through the glass sphere, but there's a puddle of water here, the man sees things right side up. The fishbowl, the glass sphere suspended in the middle, the man sees things upside down. What is Leonardo trying to show? He is making a model of the eye. The sphere of glass models the crystalline lens, which Leonardo thinks is at the middle of the eye, and he thinks its role is to re-invert the rays of light, which otherwise would make us see the world upside down. In 1602, Johannes Kepler published the first accurate depiction of the optics of the eye, and it turned out that the lens was not in the middle of the eye, but at the front of the eye, and unfortunately, the rays of light gave an inverted image at the back of the eye. And Kepler was very puzzled and wondered why it was that we see the world right side up, nevertheless. And from that time on, 4 centuries of clever people were concerned with understanding why we don't see the world upside down. Descartes has an engraving where he adopts Kepler's scheme of the optics of the eye, showing an arrow ABC being projected upside down, 5, 3, 1, at the back of the eye, being projected on the ventricles, at the inside of the ventricles of the brain, 6, 4, 2, and then being connected to the pineal gland, which Descartes thinks is the seat of the soul. But look, the connection is crossed. Obviously, so the pineal gland sees things right side up. Of course, we know now today that the upside-down image is not a problem. We know that the way information is put to use does not depend on the brain representation that's used. What's important is how the information is put to use. We see something in the right orientation when we have coherent relations between the sensory information being received and actions. Eye movements, head, arm, and body movements. This idea that what perception really is depends on the relation between perception and action, and not on the code that's used to code it, is an idea that was suggested by Donald Mackay, the cybernetician from the University of Kiel, and which he called sensorimotor contingencies. Sensorimotor contingencies should probably better be called sensorimotor dependencies, because philosophers use the word contingency in a special way. And these sensorimotor dependencies are laws that link actions to changes in sensory input. Sensorimotor contingencies define intrinsic, code-independent characteristics of perception, and they constitute what we really mean by perceiving. They're laws that are independent of the neural representation. In fact, to give Descartes the credit to which he is due, he had a picture in his book, Treatise of Man, showing a blind man crossing his sticks when he senses the outside environment, and Descartes points out that even if the blind man crosses his sticks, he will not see things inverted. So Descartes did not fall into the trap. But why is it that centuries of clever people fell into the trap of thinking that the upside-down image should give us an upside-down perception of the world? The answer is the content-vehicle confusion. It's to think that the content of perception, that is what we perceive, should somehow resemble the vehicle, that is to say, the code which the brain uses to perceive it, or to represent it. It's as though you thought that in order to see red, you had to have red fluid oozing out of your brain cells. In the case of vision, it's to think that in order to see right side up, you have to have a right side up picture inside your head. Now you might think that today nobody is so foolish as to fall into this trap. But I suggest that a number of recent and current research projects concerning vision fall into the trap. To illustrate, let me point out the following curious fact. I look out into the world. I have the impression of seeing the world rich, full of color, undistorted, and continuous. How can that be when the eye is a sensor which contains multiple defects? Consider the blind spot. That can be up to 5 degrees in diameter. So big, in fact, that you can hold an orange at arm's length, and when you close one eye, make the orange disappear in the blind spot. Yet, even with one eye closed, I don't see a hole in my visual field. Why not? The textbook answer is filling in. A neural compensation mechanism that in V1 perhaps fills in the missing pixels. Consider some other defects of the eye. You know that in peripheral vision, acuity is much worse than in central vision. So sampling of the visual field is rather non-homogeneous. You know that the cones, which are sensitive to color, are concentrated only in the central 5 or 10 degree zone. So actually, good color information is only available in a small area. And yet I don't have the impression that color disappears when I move off your red shirt somewhere else. I don't have the impression that the redness fades away. Why not? Should we postulate some kind of color filling in mechanism? You can test that there is no color vision in peripheral vision. If you get somebody to hold some colored pencils in at arm's length, you look at their nose and they bring the colored pencils in, and you try and see, without moving your eyes, what the colors are and what order they're in. You'll find that even when you put the colored pencils, when she puts the colored pencils against her ear, you're unable to say what the colors are. Color vision is atrocious outside a very small central visual field. And yet we don't have the subjective impression of lacking color. And then there's another defect of vision, eye movements. Every 3 to 5 seconds, every 3 to 5 times per second, our visual perception is interrupted by the saccadic eye movements that totally smear out and relocate the image at the back of the eye. Why don't we see this? The classic answer is a compensation mechanism that essentially builds up information taken from successive eye saccades in the outside world and projects it onto some kind of internal representation following the angle that the eye goes through, so that what we see is considered not to be the outside world, but the resultant composite image on some internal screen. This is the classic explanation of why we don't see the world move and why we don't see the perturbations due to eye movements. So to summarize up to now, we've seen several drastic defects of the visual system that would seem to demand the existence of some kind of filling in or creation of composite image in order to compensate for the defects, and which allow us to have the impression of seeing so nicely everything as we do. And these are the textbook explanations today of why vision does not have these defects. But let me make the following analogy. Consider my hand. Imagine I'm a blind person. I touch the table. I'm sampling the table with a sensor that is extremely non-homogeneous. My fingers, the palm of my hand, my fingernails, sense in a completely different way. And look, I feel the table. It seems totally continuous to me. It doesn't seem non-homogeneous. And furthermore, between my fingers there are holes. Should I not feel holes in the table where the holes are between my fingers?
Filling in.
You think really there's a filling in mechanism that fills in the holes? I think most people think that postulating a filling in mechanism for the tactile modality is stupid. Nobody would imagine, well, perhaps you. Apologies.
I just don't understand why this is a proof for anything. It's just another example.
It's an analogy for the moment. It's an analogy. So I'm suggesting that in the case of the tactile sense, not very many people have asked why it is why we would need, not many people have asked why it is that we don't feel holes in our tactile modality despite the imperfections of the eye, of the hand. Now why is this? It's because feeling the table involves probing the table with a tool, namely my hand. There's no need to compensate defects of my hand. I do not see defects of my sensor as defects of the table. I use the table as a source of immediately available information. I don't make some kind of perfected internal model of the table. So the idea is that in vision, the reason that we think we need to postulate such compensating mechanisms is because we are falling into the content-vehicle confusion of thinking that in order to see something as perfect, the representation has to be perfect. This is more tempting in the case of vision, because vision seems to us to be more perfect and more like a photograph. And we, in today's society, consider vision as to be something like a photographic sense, whereas this is not so frequent in when we think about...
I still want to ask a question. May I?
Sure.
I'm confused about two things. One is representation or the lack of representation of the sensors. Another is the representation or the lack of perfect representation of the object in the world. And I see here mixing the two. The filling in, for instance, is not a statement about representation of the photoreceptors. It's representation of the visual world, and the question is there an internal representation or not? And you can ask, I mean, it's a good question, but I don't understand the relation between this and hypothetical filling in of something in the hand. We're not talking about filling in holes in the photoreceptors. We're talking about filling in, perhaps, something about the object in the world. Is there an internal representation of a smooth, continuous object or not? but it's nothing to do with whether I have a representation of my hand or holds in my hand.
I must say,
Nobody's talking about representations of photoreceptors in the brain.
I wasn't talking about photoreceptors.
But that's the sensor. That's the analogy.
I wasn't talking about representation of photoreceptors. I was saying that people tend to postulate these compensation mechanisms. And, well, will you allow me to go on just a little bit further and then ask your question again? So I claim that, coming back to the question of why we have the impression of seeing so well despite defects of the eye, is that the idea of postulating compensation mechanisms, like filling in and the creation of a composite image, these are aspects of a content vehicle confusion. They come from the fact that we think that in order to see something perfectly, we need a perfect internal representation. Now, taking the idea of Donald Mackay of sensorimotor contingencies, we realize that in order to understand why we have the impression of seeing everything perfectly in our visual fields, we need to seek an intrinsic, that is to say, neural code independent representation, characterization of what it means to see everything. And then we realize that seeing everything means, what does it mean to see everything? My impression of seeing everything derives from being able to get the information immediately on demand. So I look ahead of myself, I have the subjective impression that I can see the door, although I know that in fact the door's information is very poor. In order to have this subjective impression, or the impression of seeing color everywhere, I get that impression because I know that immediately on demand I can get the information about the door and the color. That is sufficient for me to have something like an illusion of seeing everything simultaneously. It's like the feeling of being at home. I feel I'm at home when I'm sitting on my couch, despite the fact that I don't have to go into the kitchen, go into the bathroom, and go into the living room simultaneously. I feel at home here on my couch because I know that if I want to, I can go into each of these places. It's a potential action that I can undertake with expected results. So the apparent richness of the visual world, I claim, is a sort of illusion. There's no need for a rich internal representation of the world if, whenever I'm interested in something, I can get the information by mere movement of my eyes or of my attention. Now, if this is true, it implies an important role for our knowledge and expectations. In order to know or have the impression that I can get information about the door or the red shirt over there immediately on demand, I have to be able to know, I have to know how to get there. I have to have some information of where it is, and I have to have the instructions that allow me to get it immediately. So psychologists know, of course, that knowledge is a very important aspect of perception. They do experiments like this here, where you think you see the illusion of seeing. I don't know if somebody sees something else. It does not say the illusion of seeing. There's two instances of the word of. Most people, or half of the audience, will generally not see the second occurrence of the word of, because of course you don't see what you're looking at, you see what you think you know you're looking at. And of course another thing psychologists know about is the role of attention, which is another aspect of this. And psychologists, of course, do lots of experiments on attention. This is an experiment to test your attentional powers. There's this coin, which you have to follow. And it's a bit difficult, because as it moves around, there's going to be other stuff going on. And you have to tell me where the coin ends up at the end, concentrating on the location of the coin. It's not so hard, but you have to keep concentrating on where the coin is. And psychologists do this to show sort of how difficult it is to keep your attention on something when there's all sorts of other interference. Okay. Now, please, would you raise your hand if you saw the green pepper? Please raise your hand if you saw the green pepper. So about a third of the audience saw the green pepper. I'll show you the video again, and now you'll see the green pepper. So this phenomenon is called inattentional blindness. It was first developed by Neisser, by Nakasane, and there's a wonderful demonstration with a gorilla that goes across the visual field. It's the invisible gorilla, and there's a wonderful book that's just come out by Chabry and Simons, Dan Simons, who's the inventor of the invisible gorilla effect, which I could not show you because it's his copyright, but this is my feeble imitation. The inattentional blindness effect is an important factor in traffic accidents. It is the third most frequent cause of accidents in the world after drunken driving and driving at night. Looked but failed to see is a phenomenon where you are driving along and you are looking straight ahead of you at the traffic, you think, and you're about to go over, say, for example, a railway crossing. It's a railway crossing you go over every day. And today, unfortunately, there's a train going across, and you're looking right at the train, and you drive into the train. If you look on the web, accidents on railway crossings, you will find hundreds of examples of pictures of people driving sideways into trains. This is the most frequent cause of accidents at train crossings. It's not cars trying to go by before the train, it's cars running into trains. Okay? Because what you look at is not what you see. What you see is what you think you're seeing, what you're expecting. This is the look but fail to see phenomenon. So back now to more reflections about the content-vehicle confusion. Let me ask another question. Why do we have the impression of seeing continuously? Surely we should have gaps in our perception corresponding to blinks and eye movements. Do we need to postulate some kind of temporal filling-in process that generates a continuous, ongoing brain process to give us the impression of temporal continuity? Content-vehicle confusion. To think that in order to see something continuously, the brain has to be continually active is to make the same mistake as to think that in order to see red, you have to have red stuff oozing out of your blood, of your brain cells. Seeing continuous brain activity is a code. The code for continuity need not be itself continuous. For you to see continually, to have this impression, you have to take the sensorimotor approach and ask, what does it mean to see continually? What is the intrinsic meaning of continuity? And then you realize that what it means is that whenever you check, it's there. Okay? There's no need for continually active brain representation. It's like the light in a refrigerator. You open the door, the light's on. You close the door. You say, the light, is it still on? You sneak the door open, it's still on. Every time you open the door, the light is on, so you have the impression the light is continually on. The same is true of the visual world outside. Now, that is one thing that can give us the impression of continuity, the fact that whenever we check well, we can get the information through a movement of our eyes or of attention. There happens to be another thing which guarantees this illusion of continuity, and that is something that is hardwired into our visual systems, and it is what I would call transient detectors. It's the fact that our visual systems are hardwired to detect sudden luminance changes or motion. And this means that as soon as something changes slightly in the visual field, our attention is immediately directed to it. And so it gives us the impression that if anything should change, I am aware of it. I have tabs on it. I can get information about it. So it's as though I'm the guardian of some area, and I know that I can see it all simultaneously because the proof is that whenever anything happens, I can see it. But I'm suggesting that in fact, you're not seeing anything. You just got these transient detectors that are telling you that something has happened, and then you see it. But actually, you're not seeing anything most of the time. Now, the transient detectors, how do they work? Well, if, for example, you're looking at a scene and something changes in the scene, the transient detectors detect it, your attention is immediately focused on it, and you see it. And this gives you the impression that you had seen the bag all along. And I claim, no, you had not seen the bag all along. You just think you saw it all along because I changed it and you saw it. So the proof of this is that I can swamp out the work of these transient detectors by putting a big transient all over the picture, and that way I will swamp the action of any local change that occurs, and your attention will not be attracted to it, and unless you happen to have known where the change was, you won't see it. So here, this is one picture, this is the global transient, and this is the completely different picture, which many of you, well, maybe you've already seen this, but many of you who have not seen it will take a long time before you realize that it is the reflection in the bottom right, which is turning on and off. Now, notice it occupies, I'd say, about a fifth of the picture. Surely you should see it. You should have, if you were really seeing everything, then you should have seen it. Now, some people have argued, well, my argument is all wrong. In fact, there is an internal representation, but this white transient all over this white screen all over the picture, somehow by some physiological mechanism, wipes out the internal representation. So I do the following experiment, where I add in a transient which is not all over the picture, but is just localized in a few places. So picture number 1, picture number 2, a completely different picture. I put these sort of mud splash things on it, which created local transients that distracted your attention away from the real change, which here was completely visible and not masked at all by the transients. So I'll do it again. Raise your hand if you saw the change. It's not. Half of the people have seen the change. The change is the dotted line in the middle of the road, which is not masked at all by mud splashes. So this phenomenon is called change blindness. It's a big literature on it. It can even be done in real life situations. Here is Dan Levin, who stopped somebody on the campus asking him directions to the library. And Dan Levin is going to be replaced by Dan Simons. And the man just started talking to him. And what's interesting here is that then Dan Simons says to the man, "Did you notice anything funny?" And the man says, "No, nothing funny really, except the people who passed between us, very impolite." And Dan Simons says, "Yes, but did you not notice anything else that was odd?" And the man says, "No, why?" And Dan Simons says, "Well, didn't you notice that I'm no longer me?" And the man looks at him and he says, "Why, yes, you're not the same person." So what's interesting is that at the same time, this man somehow knew that something had happened, but it was somehow not available to him. And I think this is similar to what happens in these change blindness experiments. The information is there, but because the transient is not there to tell you to attend to it, you don't see it. Consciously seeing something involves attending to it. Wait, one more second. Let me go on one more thing. This is important. This is another way of masking out the transients. Here, this is a picture which is changing so slowly that the transients do not attract your transient detectors. And so whereas there's a very big change occurring here, many of you will not see the change. So please raise your hand, but don't say what it is when you see the change. This picture is already quite different from the preceding one. So there's 2 people here. The change occupies, I'd say, maybe a third of the whole picture area. This is quite a different picture. Okay, so I'll show you the change by making a transient, the whole ground plane changed color from red to blue. Okay? So this is a well-known phenomenon called change blindness, a lot of literature on it. Okay, so now I can take your question.
You treat differently to internal representation and perception, what you perceive. So I'm not sure I understand where is the difference.
I don't think I even mentioned the word representation, have I? I said there's a neural representation. I'm saying that one should not confuse the neural code with one should not confuse the content with the vehicle. But I don't understand your question.
You say that you don't have to have a continuous internal representation in order to perceive
Continuously. Yes.
I'm not sure I understand the difference.
I'm saying that, well, I think these illustrations show that our sensation of seeing something continually does not require there being in the brain some picture that is continually somehow active. And because I can show by these demonstrations that another way of giving people the illusion that they're seeing continually is that if anything should change, it will immediately be visible, or if they should wonder whether something is there, that it is immediately available. That's another way of giving people the impression they're seeing continuously. So the brain could use that form of knowledge or information or representation instead of actually having a picture which is continually present inside the brain. Okay, so I've talked up to now about why we have this impression of seeing everything despite defects of the visual field, and why we see continuously despite interruptions. And notice that my very simple philosophical idea concerning the content-vehicle confusion has led to two empirical predictions in attentional blindness and change blindness. These are empirical research paradigms that have been generated by a simple philosophical idea. So this simple philosophical idea is not vacuous, okay? It actually orients your research paradigm and changes the way you do science. Now let me ask another question. Why does red look red rather than looking green? So the classic way of thinking about color is to say, well, we all know that in the lower visual system we have pathways that are sensitive to the equilibrium between red and green, and to the equilibrium between yellow and blue, as well as black and white. And presumably, when we see something that is really very, very red, then the red-green pathway will be maximally activated in the red direction, for example. And I'd call this the neural correlative consciousness approach to understanding the redness of red, because it seeks a correlate of the feel of red in some neural activation. The trouble is that this idea needs a linking hypothesis that links a neurophysiological mechanism to a sensory experience. We need to explain why the red sensitive pathway gives rise to the redness field rather than the greenness field, or rather than, say, the sound of a bell. If we thought the difference was due to something about, say, the neurotransmitters, then we could again ask what was special about the different neurotransmitters involved in the different sensations. If we thought it was something to do with the connectivity or the frequency of oscillation, we would then have to ask, what is it about this connectivity or this frequency of oscillation that makes it look red rather than looking green or like the sound of a bell? Whatever explanation you give in terms of neurophysiological, physico-chemical mechanisms, you can always ask another question. Why is it that way rather than this way? So I think there's a problem of, there's a logical problem of infinite regress. And I think that the problem is actually due to a form of the content-vehicle confusion. Looking in the brain for an explanation of why red feels like red, rather than sounding like a bell, is ultimately to make the same mistake as to think that there's a red fluid oozing out of brain cells that causes redness. So in order to avoid this problem, we have to search for what it really means to see red, an intrinsic characterization of redness that is neural code independent. So at first it seems counterintuitive to imagine that the sensation of redness should somehow be determined by sensorimotor contingencies. But with the student, David Philippona, we managed to find a way to do this. What we proposed is, instead of looking at light coming into the eye, we would look at the colors of surfaces, and we would propose that what we really mean by redness is the law that characterizes the way red surfaces change the ambient light. So you have a red surface, you hold it under more yellowish sunlight, or more bluish skylight, or more reddish incandescent light, and the light coming into your eye as you move the surface around in this way changes, of course, drastically. And yet the surface carries on looking red. Why is that? It's because what we mean by red is simply the invariance. It's what is common about. It's a law that links the incoming to the outgoing light. It's something abstract. Yes.
But you don't have access to the incoming, right? All you have is the outgoing.
Well, in fact, that's true, probably, because you never look directly at the incoming light. But you can get an estimation of the incoming light by looking at all the other surfaces around.
But for them, it's the same thing. How do you know that the objects around are blue or otherwise? So you don't really have access to the law if you don't have access to the input and output.
That's true. The thing is that in normal circumstances, you have a variety of colors in the environment, and so you can take statistics and solve this problem. This is what color scientists call the problem of color constancy, and they know that it doesn't always work, which means that in many cases you think that a color is one color when in fact it's not. When you take it out into the sunlight, you see that it wasn't the color you thought it was.
You're saying you're looking at the red node, and in the background there's a tree. So if you know that the trees leaves should be green, and so you see.
No, I'm not. That's not what. No. That might be a mechanism, but most color scientists don't take account of that kind of more semantic knowledge about what things should be. They just assume that there's a sufficiently large sampling of colors in a room, and that you can estimate. You can do statistics and estimation in order to get an idea of what, on average, the ambient lighting is. But let me leave those as technicalities that I want to leave to the side and just take a very simple approach and see how far it goes. So using the simple idea that what we mean by red is nothing about the actual light coming into the eye, but it is a sensorimotor contingency in the extent that it should be conceived as a law that links incoming light to outcoming light as you move the surface around. Taking that idea has led us to two surprising discoveries which explain data that has never been accounted for by current color scientists and appeal to neurophysiological data. And this is one. If you take these Munsell color chips and you take them around the world and you show them to cultures all around the world, hundreds of cultures. This was done by anthropologists Berlin and Kay in their so-called World Color Survey. And you ask people whether they have names for these different colors. It turns out that some of the colors are preferentially given names to, whereas others are not. And those colors that are preferentially given names to are those peaks in that great histogram over there, which I have illustrated here. These red, yellow, green, and blue patches are the colors that are usually given names to by cultures around the world. They are this particular group of Munsell chips of red, yellow, green, and blue. Now, Berlin and Kay and color scientists have looked in the nervous system and in those yellow, blue, and red-green opponent color systems to see if they could use what's known about those systems to predict these colors, and they have failed. They have managed to predict the boundaries between the colors, but they have not been able to predict the exact peaks of these color distributions. On the other hand, using our sensorimotor approach, we've looked at the input-output laws that describe the behavior of colored surfaces. We can calculate simply from the reflectivity and the absorption spectrum of the three cone types in the eye, and the reflectivity calculated by physicists of the different muscle chips. We can calculate the mapping that links incoming to outcoming light for all these muscle chips. It turns out to be a very simple calculation. They turn out to be described by simply 3x3 matrices. So, in fact, each muscle chip is very accurately described by a 3x3 matrix. That is the law. The sensorimotor law of color is a 3x3 matrix. And my mathematician looked at those matrices, and he said, what's special about the red, green, yellow, and blue matrices? And it turns out he did a singular value decomposition, and he found that they were singular. That's to say that instead of projecting a 3-vector into a 3-vector, they projected a 3-vector into a 2-vector or a 1-dimensional vector. In other words, red, green, yellow, and blue are colors which have the property that they modify the incoming light in a simpler way than other colors. And we plotted what we call the Singularity Index, which is a measure of the singularity of these 3x3 matrices. And these contour plots have their peaks exactly where, or almost exactly within one chip here, of the peaks of the color distribution measured by the anthropologists. And this prediction was entirely made from philosophy and mathematics. There was absolutely no parameter adjustment. It was entirely first principles. Now, there's another quite independent victory, I would say, of philosophy and the sensorimotor approach to do with a thing called unique hues. Unique hues are the colors that people consider are pure. So you take a piece of colored paper or colored light, you get people to look at it, and you ask them to adjust the color of the illumination until the color looks completely red. That is to say, it doesn't have any blue or yellow component to it. So essentially, you're trying to null the amount of information in the blue-yellow channel. Now, if unique colors were determined by these color opponent channels, then you would expect that if you show people these colored chips and you ask them to adjust the colors so that they are uniquely red, yellow, blue, and green, they would correspond on this graph here showing the excitation of the red-green channel and the blue-yellow channel for these chips. You would expect to find the vertical and horizontal, the data to lie on vertical or horizontal lines. But it turns out that's not what happens. The data are off the vertical and horizontal. For example, to see something as uniquely blue, you have to put a little bit of green. You have to put a little bit of green in it for it to appear uniquely blue. So you see that here. Unique blue needs a little bit of the green activation to appear uniquely blue. So the neurophysiological approach to unique hues somehow doesn't work, and you need to make some ad hoc proposal to explain why the data lie there. But we have applied the sensorimotor approach to this, and what we find are predictions are these black lines here, which lie smack in the middle of the observed data. Again, without any parameter adjustment. And then there's another thing that the sensorimotor approach predicts. And it is the fact that since these are sensorimotor laws that are involved in seeing colors, you'd expect that if you artificially change the law, well, one law that obtains concerning color is that you know that in central vision you have high density of color-sensitive cones. In peripheral vision you have low sampling by these color-sensitive cones. So essentially the information available in central and peripheral vision changes. And so when you move on and off a color, you get different information. And this is one kind of sensorimotor law that is characteristic of a given color. So you would expect that if you take somebody, you get him to wear spectacles like this, and you get them to wander around for a few weeks wearing these spectacles, that when they look straight ahead at, initially when they put on the spectacles, they look straight ahead. No, they look at say a white or gray patch of color on the computer, and you get them to hold their head one way, it will look tinged more blue, and you get their head to look the other way, it should be tinged more yellow. And then you expect that after a couple of weeks, they adapt, and they look at the same patch of color on the screen, and wherever they hold their head, it will look the same, despite the fact that on the eye, it's being sampled in a different way. So there's a sensorimotor component that determines the qualia, or the perceived sensory quality of color. And then when you take off the colored glasses, again, despite the fact that you're looking at it with the same retinal region, you move your head, now the color again appears tinged with yellow or blue. Now let me go on to another very profound question about vision. Why is vision visual, not auditory or tactile? So again, under the classical view of you would expect that vision seems, or audition seems auditory because it excites auditory cortex, whereas vision seems visual because it excites visual cortex. I think this is another example of the content-vehicle confusion. Okay, it is to think that an explanation lies in modes of excitation in the brain, and I think that, in fact, in order to seek an explanation of the difference between seeing and hearing, we need, again, an intrinsic, neural code independent characterization of what it is to see and what it is to hear. Let me take the example of a sponge. If I ask myself, where is the softness of a sponge generated in the brain? And I think, again, that is perhaps a wrong question. You wouldn't ask that question for the softness of a sponge, because we know that softness is not the kind of thing that's generated. Softness is to do with what you do when you press on a sponge. It squishes under your pressure. So what is meant by softness is a sensorimotor contingency concerning the mode of interaction you have with soft things. Now we would go and look in the brain for the softness circuit that is excited when you feel softness. At least there certainly are circuits in the brain that respond when you squish on sponges, but it's not that's somehow generating the softness, because the softness is not something that is generated. The softness is a fact about how you interact with sponges. It's an abstract law that describes your relationship with sponges. You should not go looking in the brain for something that generates it. So if we want to apply that approach to the difference between seeing and hearing, we should not look in the differences in the neurotransmitters or connectivity of neurons in V1 or in the auditory cortex. We should look rather at what you do when you hear and when you see, and how these things are different. And then you can establish lots of different facts about the laws that determine the laws of hearing and the laws of seeing. When you move forward, you have an expanding flow field in the sensory input. When you're seeing, it's quite a different law when you're hearing. Now, this predicts something interesting. See, philosophy here again is predicting a line of research. It suggests that if this were true, then it should be possible to make an apparatus that allows you to see through your skin, provided that the laws of input-output that you get through your skin are obeyed, that the laws of input-output that you get through your skin are those laws that you usually get through the visual sense modality. And that has been done by Bakirita back in the 1970s with an apparatus where he connects a video camera to some electronics connected to an array of vibrators that a blind person will hold on their abdomen or on their back. And Bakirita, back in those days, found that very, very quickly a blind person is able to navigate around in the world. Importantly, he does not feel vibrations on his stomach or on his back anymore. He feels that the information is out there in the world. He sort of projects it outwards. And with practice, he's able to recognize simple objects. there is a whole research domain of sensory substitution. Amir Ahmadi here is one of the proponents of this interesting research paradigm, where people are looking more at how sensory substitution occurs and how it can be set up, and how it affects the brain. Now, let me ask another, even more profound philosophical question. The philosopher's question about the qualia, or what it is like of the feel of seeing, would be, why does vision seem present to us at all? Why when we see something, does it feel like something rather than feeling like nothing? This is the philosopher's question of phenomenal consciousness, qualia. There seems to be a special quality associated with seeing, in the sense that there really is something it's like to see. Now, this is rather vague. Philosophers are rather vague about this. So to understand what we really mean by saying that there seems to be something it's like to see, consider the fact that we can establish a hierarchy of something it's likeness. So we agree that seeing really feels like something to us, but autonomic processes, for example, like digestion or the control of blood sugar, are things that just have no feel to them. It doesn't feel like anything. And in between these two extremes, one could put these different mental activities. When I think about a red patch of color, I don't really feel the same thing as when I'm really seeing it. I think this notion of the philosophers of there being something it's like is neatly kind of illustrated by this hierarchy of what it is likeness. Now, obviously, under, again, the sensorimotor approach, it would be a mistake to search for something in the neural mechanisms that generates the special quality of something it's like, and does it more for the seeing than these other mental processes. We have to look for some objective physical fact about the interactions that we have with the world when we are doing these different activities, in order to account for the presence, the visual presence that we have when we experience vision. So, what do we know about the objective laws that govern visual interactions with the world, which could account for our feeling of visual presence? Remember grabbiness, the fact that our visual systems are hardwired so that visual transients incontrovertibly attract our attention. This is an objective aspect of our visual systems. I postulate that it's something that's really hardwired. Possibly, maybe there are special nerve pathways leading from transient detectives in the lower visual system up into high-level cognitive processing, so that whenever there's a big flash of light or a change in the visual field, I essentially stop thinking about what I'm thinking about now, and I start thinking about the thing that has changed. I postulate that a physicist or physiologist could come in and measure the degree to which such a hardwired circuit exists in the brain. It's an objective fact about our visual systems. And now think about whether these, it's clearly true of seeing. Think about autonomic processes. If there's a sudden change in my blood sugar, admittedly, it will make me perhaps feel weak, but I sense that not through some kind of feeling of weakness. I feel weak because my capacities have diminished. I don't think there's a direct change, and my attention is not directly oriented to that in any way. When I think about something, since it's me, myself, doing the thinking, there can be nothing that suddenly, in my thought, grabs my thoughts and causes them to go somewhere else, since the thoughts are entirely under my control. Remembering also has no grabbiness. Imagine, for example, that overnight I forget the third person singular of the Latin verb amo. When I wake up in the morning, I'm not aware of it unless I think about it. Today, what is the third person singular of amo? No bell or whistle blew, during the night that woke me up when that neuron disappeared from my memory. That entity disappeared from my memory. Whereas in vision, any change in the visual field immediately attracts my attention. So thinking, remembering, doesn't have any grabbiness. Perhaps hallucinating, dreaming, imagining, perhaps not imagining, since when you imagine something, I don't think there can be any grabbiness. Perhaps there's a bit of grabbiness here. So I think this is one objective quality of the visual interaction, which is correlated with this feeling of presence. Now consider another fact about visual interactions. It's what I call bodiliness. Bodiliness is the fact that voluntary motions of our body systematically affect sensory input. It's an aspect of sensory interactions which distinguishes them from autonomic processes in the nervous system and from thoughts. So if I'm wandering around and I move my body, it doesn't affect my glucose level. It doesn't affect autonomic processes in my nervous system in any systematic way. If I'm thinking about red and I move around, my thoughts don't change. If I'm seeing red, my thoughts change. If I'm seeing red, there's a drastic change in sensory input when I move my body. So bodiliness, I think, again, is a good indicator, correlates very well with this notion of sensory presence. Actually, bodiliness has a sort of subsidiary notion, which is that bodiliness is never complete. An aspect about things in the visual world is that they have a life of their own. Whereas I can create changes in my sensory input by moving, there are some changes in the sensory input that are created by things moving by themselves. Okay? This is an insubordinateness of the outside world as compared to my own sensory input. So there's bodiliness is not complete. There's insubordinateness. And what I would postulate, and this is much more tentative, what I would like to do is to account for what it is like, the fact that the vision has a phenomenal presence, contrary to these other mental processes. In my sensorimotor approach, I have to account for this in terms of objective laws that characterize the sensorimotor interaction we have with the world when we have these different experiences. And I think here we have a first suggestion of a way that we could go to objectively characterize this. So in conclusion, we've seen that when we experience a visual sensation, by taking the sensorimotor approach, we can account for the experienced quality of that sensation. The quality is constituted by the laws of sensorimotor interaction that we engage in when we have the experience. Now, something is missing still. Surely even devices like video cameras or other machines can be said to interact with their environments. So surely then we can also define sensorimotor laws. And yet we don't want to say that these machines feel anything. What's missing? What's missing is that the machines, although they engage in a sensorimotor interaction, are not aware of it. They don't have the necessary cognitive capacities to pay attention to and to make use of the fact that they're engaged in an interaction. So really we have to say that in order to have a conscious experience, you have to have sufficient cognitive capacities to attend to or cognitively access the fact that you're engaged in the sensorimotor interaction of seeing. I don't have time to go further into this, but I don't think that this poses a problem for science, because I think attending, cognitively accessing are things that we can understand from a scientific point of view. But in order to understand the conscious experience of seeing, I described the quality of the experience to the sensorimotor interaction, and I described the fact that we attend to and cognitively access it here. And I think when we have the two, that is what we mean when we say we are consciously experienced. So, in summary, the standard view of what the experience of seeing is supposes that it's the brain that creates the field. This standard view leads to the hard problem of explaining how physico-chemical processes might generate something psychological, namely the experienced quality of vision, which is something that is out of the realm of physics and chemistry. So this explanatory gap arises because the language of physics and chemistry is incommensurate with the language of psychology and everyday talk about what things are like. Now, the sensorimotor view overcomes this problem by conceiving of the feel of seeing as a way of interacting with the environment. The quality of the feel is simply an objective quality of the way of interacting. And the language with which we describe this objective interaction is the same language we use in everyday life, and so it is commensurate with the with the way we describe our fields, because it's the same language. So that's the end of my talk. This is my book, which is coming out in May, which you can consult for further information. Thank you very much.
Questions? On.
In a problem that I'm not sure about the solution, about your positive view, because one way to explain the problem is, I mean, so the problem is very well, so we should make kind of representation to use. I mean, this was routinely done in the history of philosophy, so you would say pictorial representation, symbolic representation, and now you come and say, well, we should replace them with sensorimotor representations, and I'm just not sure that this is what you mean and how they look like. Or you can say we can do without representations at all, but then when you explain things, you use the terms information, coding, so it looks like you have some kind of representational view. So my question is, what exactly?
I think there's a big misunderstanding here, because if you read my BBS paper, and many people have only read that paper, they think that my whole theory is about rejecting representations. And that is not at all what this is about. Not today anymore. Maybe I made a mistake in the past. Okay. My point today is, it's not representations I'm rejecting. What I'm rejecting is the idea that the brain is generating sensation. It's the notion of generation. I think I'm cheating in a way, because I'm making the same step that was made at the beginning of the 20th century, when people changed their view about what life was, and modern biology took over old forms of thinking about what life was. At the beginning of the 20th century, people thought that life required something extra in organic matter, and that they were looking for a vital spirit that generated life in organic systems. And nowadays, we know that life is not the kind of thing that's generated, because life is just a word. It's a word that describes the way certain organisms, certain systems interact with their environment. It's a word. It's an abstraction. It's not something that can be generated. And by taking that stance, we've essentially opened up a whole new science. And I'm suggesting we should do the same with experience and feel. We should reject the idea that it's in the brain that we should look for something that generates feel. I'm suggesting, just like life was not the kind of thing that can be generated, feel is also not the kind of thing that can be generated. You should change your view about what feel is, and you should consider feel to be a word. It's a word that describes the way we interact with the environment. And taking that stance opens up these different research paradigms. The question of representation is sort of a red herring, because it's true. I mean, it's the content-vehicle confusion problem. It's the problem that when you think about representations in the brain, you tend to think about the representations in terms of photographs, if you're thinking about vision. And then there's a slippery slope that slides down into making you think it's necessary to postulate filling in mechanisms, eye movement compensation mechanisms, saccadic suppression mechanisms. These things, they may be there, okay, but they don't have to be there, and it's a content-vehicle confusion that you fall into because the representation you've imagined is the wrong one. Now, I have nothing against there being information or knowledge, or if you want to call it representations, existing in the brain. And the brain is doing something, and the brain holds information. But it's a slippery slope to use the word representation, because it so easily lets you slide into the content-vehicle confusion.
I want to follow with that. The examples that you gave in the color system, so So you said that prototypical colors actually have some objectives, if you will, present in them.
Yeah.
But that's what you, I think, in some way might be misleading in the sense that then you kind of ignore computation, maybe not representation, but computation as a replacement for it. Because I think many people would agree that sensorimotor looks are essential part of it, but they would also say that you need a computation in order to graph something out. So for example, in the color system, sometimes you are misled by context, for example. Even though it's objective, and even though it's there, you don't see it, because there is an added computation that is being taken place in the brain.
Right.
And I think that was perhaps missing from the top.
Okay.
That aspect.
I agree with you entirely, and that kind of consideration is going to explain exactly as you say why color consistency is not perfect, why we don't see the colors the way they objectively are necessarily. I agree with you, but ultimately, my whole idea of rejecting the idea that feel or experience is something generated in the brain generates a different way of thinking about what the brain might be doing. But I obviously 100% agree that the brain is computing something, and what our job is to try and figure out how that computation occurs, and when it makes mistakes is a very interesting and enriching field of study.
So you do not argue against the word representation, neither the word generation, actually, because what you do when you compute, you generate something. The neural activity generates all these things you talk about, say the sensorimotor contingencies, etc., is generated by these computations. So would you agree to say that the representation is the representation of my predictions about the contingencies that are being tested by looking at the inputs, and then you are not too far from saying that we have something that is generated by computation, which is this perception.
Well,
so
the brain is
trying to cool you down.
The brain is doing computations, and if you're an engineer and you go in and you look what those computations are, you might find some kind of forward model or inverse model or something where you could describe it in terms of predictions and comparisons and things like that. But what I'm saying is that the output or input of such models is not what we see. Okay, so it's not true that the brain, these predictions, expectations, or representations that the brain is, if you want to use the word generating, are not what we see. They do not constitute our experience, because our experience is not the kind of thing that is constituted, or is not the kind of thing that is generated by anything. It's just a category error, as the philosophers call it. It's a category error to think about experience in terms of the vital spirit analogy. It's not something that emanates from inside our brains or by our brains, because experience is just an abstraction. It's like life. Do you think life is generated by your heart? No. Do you think life is generated by your brain? No. Life is just simply not generated. Okay? But people used to think life was generated, and that's the mistake. The same mistake is people usually every day they think that their brains are generating the redness field. If you think about it, this is a mistake. It's what the philosophers call this category error. If you just make a mental shift and you think that experience is not generated, and you think it's just a way of describing a certain interaction you have, then it completely changes your research strategies. It doesn't mean the brain isn't making what an engineer seen from the outside would call representations, predictions, expectations, but these would be the mechanics that the engineer would use. But in no way is that what the individual is perceiving or experiencing himself, because experience is not generated; it's an abstraction.
I think we should thank the speaker again.